When you take fear and you take future and you mush those together, you get fear of the future, which is basically worry and anxiety. And that hasn't been shown to be adaptive. In fact, it's anti-adaptive. Anxiety has a whole host of physical and mental, negative consequences. I detailed my negative physical consequences to sound like you had some similar ones.
Right.
Yet we can look to see where it comes from.
Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Kasim Al-Mashat, Registered Psychologist, Mindfulness and Yoga teacher, and founder of the Center for Mindfulness Canada in Vancouver. Today's guest is Dr. Judson Brewer, also likes to be known by Dr. Judd, MD, PhD, a neuroscientist, a psychiatrist, New York Times bestseller. His TEDx talk is really good. It has over 18 million views. A simple way to break a bad habit. He's also the ShareCare's chief medical officer. He's a thought leader in habit change and science of self-mastery. He's the author of Craving Mind, from cigarettes to smartphones to love, why we get hooked and how we can break bad habits. Oh, we all have some kind of bad little habit, right? So we'll have something. And he's also the author of Unwinding Anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycles of worry and fear to heal your mind. And I have to say, I just finished it a couple of days ago. It's really a fantastic book. He has developed and tested app-based mindfulness programs for habit change, including treatments for anxiety, emotional eating, smoking for a wider audience. And to learn more about Dr. Judd's work, you can visit drjudd.com. Oh, and I didn't mention, he's also the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center and Associate Professor at Brown's Medical School and MIT Research Affiliate. So you're kind of busy. You got things. So just want to extend a warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. I wonder if we can start from there, about mindfulness and meditation, before we get into your work specifically about habit change. Many people wonder, we're too busy to take time from the day to sit and try to meditate. Life is too busy. And you are an exemplar of you've got so many things happening in life, such contribution in the world, and yet you have time to meditate. What can you say a little bit about that? How do people find time to meditate?
I would say we don't have time not to.
It
is so important. And also, it's not that we have to be, sitting down for hours at a time, on a cushion. I think it's important to notice and really bring these practices into our daily lives. And so we can be bringing in short moments of mindfulness throughout our days. And I think it's really critical that we learn, how our minds work and how to work with our minds, and paying attention is a really critical ingredient for that.
Yeah, sometimes people get stuck on I have to meditate this long, otherwise nothing is changing in my mind, and they miss the informal practice, and just getting some practice done is still helpful.
Sometimes. Yes. Yeah. Especially, and if we go in I have to meditate, then we're, we're going in with an agenda it's almost like checking it off of our list of things that we have to do. And we might miss the whole premise and the purpose of why we're doing it in the first place.
Yes. Let alone enjoying it, right?
Yes.
It becomes another to do. So I'm wondering, what led you to mindfulness yourself? I know you share in your book as well your journey of what led you to it. I wonder if you can share a little bit about what led you, what was the pull for you to mindfulness and meditation?
I think a lot of it was suffering, this 10,000 hours rule, which was popularized, but probably not completely scientifically valid. But let's just say I've surpassed that 10,000 hours of suffering, just like many people have. And so I think the suffering element, where I was suffering, I had gone at the end of college, I'd actually gone through a bad relationship breakup. and was really having trouble getting to sleep. And it turned out that, this book by John Kabat-Zinn landed in my lap, and I started reading it and decided that my first day of medical school, I'd start, starting a new pathway in my life. And so I decided that would be a good day to start meditating as well.
And that was at Princeton, I think you shared. Was that when you began
I
your practice?
just graduated from
From Princeton,
Princeton
just
and was
graduated.
headed to medical school. Yes.
Medical school, yeah. Because you know what's really struck me as you shared the story in your book as well is you were very active, you were engaged in many clubs at university, you were like full of energy and action and life. And these panic attacks would kind of wake you up at night, and you realize, wait a minute, there's something I need to work with here. And you used it, this pulse. Can you say a little more about that? Because that's very inspiring how you use something that you struggled with and now you teach about.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, I didn't even realize that I was anxious in college. It was showing up in my GI tract. I'll save you the gory details, but basically my GI tract was telling me that I was, there's something that was off. And despite doing, I was like, well, I went to see the physician at the student health, and said, oh, I'm having these issues, and he was saying, oh, could you be stressed out? And he's like, and I was thinking, no, I run, I play the violin, I'm a vegetarian, I can't be stressed. Step back, and he's like, okay. And it turned, years later, I looked back on that and could see I basically had irritable bowel syndrome, where my bowels were they were irritated with me, in the sense that that I was really, really anxious and stressed out and didn't even know it. And so, my body was trying to get my attention in any way that it could. And that was a wake up call for me, in terms of, you can't just be checking off a bunch of things on a list and expect yourself, not to be stressed out and not to be anxious.
Right. So you took it as signal that something needed attention.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because often, we ignore it. I know I had something similar myself that led me to this path, and they thought it was colitis, they thought it was IBS. It's just like, but it was my body screaming at me.
Yeah.
And it's confusing because the more I wanted to control it, the more it's like, no. Right.
Yeah. It's really another highlight of how letting go is really the only form of control that we have in those situations. And the more we try to control things, the worse they get. Certainly, it's been my experience.
Yes. I wonder if you can say a little bit about that, this worrying and control. Why do we worry? What if you can share a little bit about, like, why do we even have that in our being, this capacity to worry and think, and when it's unhelpful?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And often people assume that worrying must have some evolutionary adaptive advantage, otherwise we wouldn't do it. So the long story short there is that there's nothing that's been shown scientifically that worry is actually helpful for us. Yet we can look to see where it comes from. And it comes from two helpful survival mechanisms. So fear is a helpful survival mechanism because it helps us learn. Helps us learn to avoid dangerous situations through a process called negative reinforcement, right? So if we go into some scary place and we get scared, we learn to avoid that place, right? It's pretty straightforward.
Yes.
So our survival mechanism is alive and well, and it's keeping us alive and hopefully well when we learn from fear, through these fear-based learning mechanisms. We also have a survival mechanism that helps us plan for the future. And that's where the younger, newer part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, helps us, take past experience and project it into the future and kind of predict what might happen, so we can plan and we can make decisions. And that planning process is also helpful. Anybody that's planned for a trip knows that, it's helpful to plan for a trip and not just show up at the airport expecting to get a ticket.
That's right. What do you got? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So when you put those two together, this is where it gets really interesting. When you take fear and you take future and you mush those together, you get fear of the future, which is basically worry and anxiety. And that hasn't been shown to be adaptive. In fact, it's anti-adaptive. Anxiety has a whole host of physical and mental, negative consequences. I detailed my negative physical consequences to sound like you had some similar ones.
Right.
So that anxiety piece doesn't actually help us survive, yet it makes us feel like we're doing something.
Yeah.
And it can show up through, I see this a lot in my clinic, where people they plan and then they plan again to check to see if they've missed anything. And then they get stuck in these worry cycles where they start worrying about what might happen in the future, where that planning trips into worry. Planning and checking maybe once or twice helpful, but checking 17 times where we're just spinning out and wasting that energy worrying, not so helpful.
Yeah. So the distinction is, so there's fear is helpful when more it's in the present moment rather than fearing of just the future. Is that so? Fear on planning, but fear of the present is helpful, but fear of future is not really that helpful.
Yes. And planning is also, we plan in the present moment for the future, right? But we can plan and then we can move on so that whenever the future comes, we can see if things went according to plan and we can adapt accordingly. So both of those are helpful, yet they're helpful in the present moment. When we start projecting into the future, that's when things start to go awry.
Okay. So how about when it's linked, I hear a lot of people that, anxiety is helping them. It's kind of revving them up or preparing them for something, like performance anxiety, thinking, yeah, this is just gearing me up. And what is the evidence around that?
Yeah, there is, thanks to the internet, there are a lot of websites and even books written about how anxiety is helpful for performance. Yet when you look at the data, there's no science that shows that that's true. So there's an inverse relationship between anxiety and performance. The more anxious somebody is, the worse they perform. Just watch the Olympics, the more anxious somebody is, the worse they perform. Now, there's this myth that's called the Yerkes-Dodson law, because that, it's been mythologized so much, that goes back to a study from 1908 in Japanese dancing mice. I'm not kidding. And long story short, I write in detail about this in my Unwinding Anxiety book. Long story short is that people kind of took this study of mice that was about arousal, like how aroused they are, like how much, you basically rev them up, and there's this inverted U-shaped curve where if they're asleep, they're not going to perform well. Duh.
Right.
And if they're totally, I don't know how, they shock them a bunch of times or whatever, but when they totally freak them out, they also don't perform very well. Shock, doesn't. Right. So, but when they're kind of awake and alert, they can perform better than at either of these extremes. So this inverted U-shaped curve, they called this the Yerkes-Dodson law, and people started to extrapolate that to anxiety without any evidence. And I think thanks to two things. One is that our brains are really good at making associations. So, if we're anxious, that's true, and we happen to perform well, it's true. We make this causal connection where our brains say, oh, because I was anxious, I performed well. That's that myth of cause, correlation does not equal causation.
Right.
Is the one liner on that. So because the two are correlated, our brain links the two and says, oh, that must have caused this. But until we step back and ask, well, was that true? Or did they just happen to be, present at the same time? Especially if somebody's anxious all the time.
Yes.
Their anxiety must be causing everything.
Everything. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So, and we can see pretty clearly that that's not true. So we can look at that and see that our brains like to make these correlations into causal inferences, and that's not true. We have to prove causality. And we can also look at the opposite when we are performing at our best. And I've never met anybody that says they perform at their best when they're really anxious, or even when they're moderately anxious. People report when they're in flow, that's their optimal performance mode. When they're Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described flow as effortless, joyful. It's selfless. Like
Mm,
we are so immersed in the moment, so merged with the doing of whatever we're doing, that
mm,
we're not even thinking about ourselves. So you can't possibly be anxious if you're not worried about
right.
yourself.
Right.
So so there's more evidence to just show that there's no causal connection between anxiety and performance. In
Mm,
fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. And we can just ask ourselves, when do I perform at my best? And it's not when we're anxious.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, our brains like to, it's kind of like they hold up this badge of anxiety. It's like, oh my, and we get attached to the anxiety. We get identified with it. And we think, oh, I need my anxiety,
Yes.
and then come up with reasons to hold on to it.
Yes.
It's unfortunate. It's not anybody's fault. It's just how our brains work. And the good news there is when we start to see how our brains work, we can start to put our brains to work for us instead of getting pulled along by them and stuck in these anxiety habit loops.
Yeah. When you're saying stuck, you just remind me of sometimes, on the range of anxiety and obsessions we have about thoughts, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, sometimes it might be even something true that has happened where anxiety helped. Like I got to check, the stove because one time I didn't and something burned. So if I don't check this time, what if something actually does burn? So in a way, it's basing on something true, but it's not true now. So is that the same when it's on the range of when the mind gets really obsessed and stuck about these repetitive thinking habits of OCD as an example?
Well, certainly OCD is kind of anxiety and worry on steroids,
Yeah.
where we get into this ritualistic behavior that also correlational, so
Mm,
somebody gets in a loop where they say, "Oh, I have to do this ritual or in order to prevent something bad from happening or to keep whatever the belief is." So that obsessive belief. Now, if you use the stove as an example, we can say, "Oh, well, maybe my anxiety helped me check the stove." We can also ask, what's the most efficient way to make sure that we've turned off the stove, which is to pay attention. So
mm,
we could get anxious about whether we turn the stove off or not, or we could get curious about whether we turn the stove off or not. And so if we hadn't paid attention and didn't remember if we turned the stove off or not, we could go, "Oh no, did I turn off the stove?" And we run in there in an anxious state to check to see if we turn off the stove. Or we
mm.
could get curious and go, "Oh, did I turn off the stove?" And we could go in and we could do the same behavior without the anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah. So curiosity, and I know you mentioned that in the book, how curiosity is a superpower. So, so I wonder if we can turn to that, this work of habit. And one of the things that really I found so interesting is thoughts are a habit as well, not just behavior. Can you say a little bit about that, this habit loop and how it works?
Sure. So any habit is formed with three elements: a trigger or a cue, a behavior, and a result.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this was set up to help us remember where food is. Our ancient ancestors didn't have refrigerators, so they had to go foraging for food, and they had to have a mechanism to remember where it was. And
Mm,
that mechanism, from a brain standpoint, goes like this. So we're foraging, we see the food, there's the trigger, we eat the food, there's the behavior, and then our stomach sends this dopamine signal to our brain
mm,
that says, "Remember what you ate and where you found it." And that feeds back to our to help us remember, hey, next time you're hungry, go to this food
right.
location. And same is true for avoiding danger. You see the saber-tooth tiger, you run away,
Mm.
and then you don't get eaten. There's the reward.
Yes.
So this reward-based learning system, it's
Mm,
evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. Eric Kendall got
mm,
the Nobel Prize in the year 2000, I think, showing that sea slugs learn in the same way through positive and negative
mm.
reinforcement. Now, one thing I never learned in medical school, or maybe I fell asleep in this lecture or something, was that anxiety can actually be driven like a habit. And this is
Mm,
where the mental behaviors come in terms of habits. I always thought, habits were like smoking or overeating or, things like that. But anxiety, the feeling of anxiety can be the cue or the trigger for a mental behavior of worrying.
mm,
And that mental behavior is rewarding in the sense that it makes us feel like we're in control. Now, in
mm.
fact, worrying doesn't,
Right.
doesn't actually get us any more control than not worrying does. It might get us less because it's harder to think and plan when we're freaked out, when we're worrying.
Right.
But that worrying, it has enough of that feeling of control that it feeds back to the next time we feel anxious, we can get stuck in that habit again. And it's a very, very common habit. Anxiety disorders are the largest category of, I don't
Yeah.
like the word disorder, but that's the way our current parlance is around mental health. So,
Yeah.
it's the largest category of conditions that we deal with.
Yeah. This habit loop you're mentioning as well, you got into it before with addiction, I think. Is that right? Your
Mhm.
interest. And so what did you discover there that it continues to transfer? Is it the same in terms of anxiety and
Yes, I started my research in my neuroscience research and clinical research with people with alcohol and cocaine use disorder,
Mm,
and was just looking to see if mindfulness training could help as well as gold standard treatment, which is cognitive behavioral therapy.
right.
And we found it was a small pilot study, but we found that mindfulness was as good at helping people not relapse as
Mm,
cognitive behavioral therapy, and even better at helping people not get caught up in their reactions to psychological stressors, because the stress is a big predictor of relapse. And
right.
then I took that forward with smoking cessation. I developed a program for smoking cessation that was mindfulness based, and we found that we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment. So
Wow.
blown away by that, and then started doing the neuroimaging to see what was happening in the brain, and then even developing these digital therapeutics. And we have an app for smoking, one for eating, one for anxiety.
Mm,
And so it really started with the addiction field. I'm an addiction
mm,
psychiatrist. That's my bread and butter. And it turns out that anxiety, so eating gets driven, like stress eating, overeating, emotional eating, gets driven the same way as addictions. And then, like we just talked about, anxiety can be driven in the same way as the
right.
addictive process. So this is really, addictions are kind of the far end of the spectrum of habits.
Mm,
And I like the simple definition of addiction: continued use despite adverse consequences.
oh, yeah.
And so we can start looking at that definition and say, well, it's not just chemicals like, heroin or fentanyl or cocaine or amphetamines. It's, you know, continued use of social media despite adverse
Right.
consequences, you know, continued worrying despite adverse
Yeah.
consequences. And so we can see I'm not saying that, worrying is an addiction, although I would say that a lot of
Mm,
people would say that they feel like they're addicted to worrying. They're really stuck in it
yes.
and they can't step out of it. So it's the
Mm.
same process in our brain. No matter what we call it, it's a problem.
It is absolutely, yes, and quite phenomenal in terms of the research you discovered. The effectiveness with that. And there's just a research article that came up recently about MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, comparing it to medication for anxiety. And is this your sense as well about the effectiveness? Like if we compare medication versus meditation, not to say we, let go of medication when it's needed,
Sure.
but what's the latest around that?
Yeah, certainly as a physician, I prescribe medications. And for some people, so one, the study that you're mentioning, really well done study by Liz Hoagie at Georgetown,
Mm,
showing, like you mentioned, showing that MBSR may be as effective as medications for
mm,
anxiety. And this had been shown for depression years ago.
mm,
A lot of work done by like Zindel Siegel and Willem Kuyken and others, in Canada and also in the UK, showing that that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, for example,
right.
is really helpful for depression, to the point where it's first-line treatment in the UK.
Mm,
So I think there's just growing evidence base. And the way I think of it is that for some people, medications are really helpful. So for example, with anxiety, the number needed to treat is 5.2, which means for every 5 people, one person is going to show
Mhm.
significant reduction in symptoms with a medication. That's with our best medications.
Mm.
We just did a study with our Unwinding Anxiety app with people with generalized anxiety disorder, where we got a 67% reduction in these
Wow.
clinically validated scores. And that translates to a number needed to treat of 1.6. So here, we didn't directly compare it to medications, but that number needed to treat, the lower the number, the better off.
Yes.
Yeah. So, 1.6 we were pretty blown away by how well it worked.
That's incredibly encouraging. And how does the app work itself? So if you can share a little bit about those who might be interested. So what is it? How is it laid out?
Yeah, the Unwinding Anxiety app is really set up to help people learn how their minds work so they can learn to work with their minds. And so we set it up as, 30 core modules that are about 10 minutes a day, where they get videos and animations and then in the moment exercises to help them learn how anxiety habit loops are formed, and then how to work with these anxiety habit loops. So informal mindfulness practices, formal mindfulness practices, all weave together as the core modules built to that, through that first month, let's say. And then we've got a bunch of theme weeks after that help people deepen their understanding and their practice. And it's really based around these 3 basic steps of habit change. So first, you've got to recognize that you're in a habit loop. And so it can be worry, it can be procrastination, it can be stress eating, it can be whatever. And then second, we have to tap into our brains to help us see very clearly that the old habit isn't serving us, right? This goes back to the ancient Buddhist psychology, which I absolutely love how all of this stuff lines up, where, just paraphrasing some of the suttas that Buddha talked about, it wasn't until I explored gratification to its end that knowledge and vision arose. And the idea behind that is we have to see how rewarding or unrewarding a behavior is in order for us to change. And if we explore that gratification to its end and see that something is absolutely not serving us, we're going to become disenchanted with it. And that's that second step, is we can't just tell ourselves to stop worrying. I'd love if that worked, because then my clinic would be much easier.
Right.
Yours would as well. You just, stop worrying. Next.
Yeah, just stop it. That's right.
Yeah. Yes. So there we can start to become disenchanted with these old habits. And then we can bring in this third step. I think of it as finding that bigger, better offer, which comes back to curiosity.
Yeah.
So when we are worrying, we can go, oh no, when we're feeling anxious, we can go, oh no, what's going to happen, or start worrying about the future. Or we can bring some curiosity in and focus on the what, like what's happening in this moment, instead of the why is this happening, or what's going to happen. So we flip that oh no to, oh, what does this feel like in my body? Now, I don't know about for you, but for most people, curiosity feels better than worrying.
Yeah.
And so for our brain, if we give our brain that bigger, better offer, it's going to naturally start to incline toward that which feels better. So if we can help our brain see, 1, that curiosity feels better than worrying, and 2, that curiosity can help us step out of these old habit loops, we've just tapped into this superpower where curiosity itself becomes that bigger, better offer. So that's basically what the whole app is about, is helping people actualize that.
Yeah, self-paced, very practical. And when you mention curiosity, you speak about 2 kinds of curiosity. And I wonder if you can say something about this, because I often see people getting stuck in the why and then look for information, like just go Google more, and spend long time trying to analyze themselves. Why is this happening? What's going on? So that curiosity doesn't seem to be as helpful. Can you say about that, the 2 kinds of curiosity and what can be helpful?
I'd be happy to. So the type of curiosity you're talking about is called deprivation curiosity, which means we're deprived of some information. And
Mm,
that's, you know, if we don't have information, it's helpful. So think of, you know, I don't know, our ancient ancestors when they heard some rustling in the bushes,
mm,
that deprivation of like, what is that, is helpful because they can go and check to see if it's danger or if it's just their sibling playing around, you know.
right.
So getting information is a helpful survival strategy. Yet, if we get stuck in this, like you're talking about this why, like why am I anxious, or
Mm,
you know, why is this happening to me? Those habit loops can get us going down rabbit holes that aren't actually helpful for us. So here we can shift it into, so that deprivation curiosity feels restless. It makes it feels urge. You know, we have this urge to scratch that itch. I
right.
think of it as destination curiosity, because when you get that piece of information, you've
Mm,
arrived at your destination, that itch has been scratched. In contrast, interest curiosity is the type of curiosity that I'm talking about as a superpower, because it's about the journey, it's not the destination. And
yeah.
so we're just interested in what's happening right now. So instead of why, like why is this happening, where we feel that contracted, I have to get the information
Mm,
state, we can go, oh, you know, what's happening right now? We turn toward our direct experience. When we turn toward our direct experience and get curious about it, we can see that, for example, anxiety is just made up of sensations that come and go. They might be
right.
stronger or weaker at any one moment, but they're constantly changing.
Mm,
And we can also start to see that we can change our relationship to our physical sensations. And instead of going, oh no, why am I anxious? We can go, oh, what does this feel like right now? And we can learn to coexist and be with our anxiety rather than feel like we have to do something to make it go away.
right. That is the toughest thing for a lot of people. They feel like, okay, this sounds great, but like, what do I do now?
Yeah.
Like, I need to do something about it. What do I do? Okay, great. I'm curious, but now what? And it's like slowly supporting people. I know in the mindfulness program and the one-on-one work that I do is, okay, can we be curious about like what's happening in the moment? And sometimes it takes a while for people to realize that is the way through.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You know, it's like the obstacle becomes the way, that the being becomes the doing. You know, it's like, what do I do? I be with, you know, I learn to be with my
Right.
experience. And that is the doing.
Right. You know, as you're saying that, it just made me think even on a bigger scale, this the discomfort we have with uncertainty. There's something about uncertainty that really feeds more anxiety and worry. And how to live with uncertainty in a world where, guess what? There's a lot of uncertainty. So, uh, what do you think of that? How do we live with uncertainty?
Yes. So I would say the first thing is to acknowledge that our brains don't like uncertainty, right?
Mm,
That is that survival mechanism that says, I need to get information because that's going to help me survive.
mm,
In a world where we have constant access to information and misinformation and
right.
disinformation,
Yes.
you know, suddenly we have to sort through all the information to see what is true. And we also have to ask ourselves, how much information do I need right now? Is this actually going to help me survive? And often we don't need nearly as much information as our brains get sucked into these habit loops of like looking for more information. So
Mm,
here I would, you know, just acknowledging and learning to see, yeah, our brains don't like uncertainty.
mm,
Can we move from that uncertainty driving us to scratch that itch of trying to get more information and trying to get more information and stuck in those habit loops? Can we move out of those into just the resting in the not knowing? You know,
yes.
can we get comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing? And
Mm,
then can we learn that, oh, it's okay. I don't have to know this right
mm,
now. And can I just rest in being with uncertainty? And then it's not so bad. We don't feel like
mm.
we have to scratch every uncertain itch.
I think you have a really helpful. I can put the link in the description below of how people can map their habits, which is really great. And you talk also about 3 gears. You mentioned it earlier today. So the first thing is they can use that PDF, which I'll link below yours, from Share Care about mapping the habit. And what would you suggest they would do as a
Well, I
start?
would say, Yeah, so that habit mapper, and I think, yeah, it's just mapmyhabit.com, I think is the
Right.
website.
Right.
It starts with just mapping out our habits. What's the trigger, what's the behavior, what's the result? And even if we can't identify the trigger, just seeing the behavior and the result is a really good place to start mapping.
Mm.
That's that first step, or the first gear. Then we shift into second gear. As we build momentum, we start to ask ourselves the simple question: what am I getting from this?
Wow.
And that helps us become disenchanted with our old behaviors. That's that cause and effect relationship. And we see, how rewarding is this behavior really?
Mm.
When we become disenchanted, we can then shift into this third gear and take that third step where we find that bigger, better offer and step out of these old habit loops. So often just stepping out of an old habit feels better than being stuck in it.
Mm.
Worry, for example, doesn't feel good. And when we're not worrying, it feels better.
Right.
We can also use curiosity as a way to step out and have that curiosity
Mm.
be that new, that bigger, better offer. So instead of going, oh no, we can go, oh, what does this feel like? I would
Mm.
also add to that, often we judge ourselves. We get in habit loops
Right.
of judging ourselves. So we can start to explore, what is it like to be kind to ourselves
Mm.
as a bigger, better offer if we're stuck in judgment habit loops. So that's the three steps, or the three gears, in a nutshell.
Mm. So kindness actually is helpful too. So it's not just we're actually also wired for kindness.
Yes.
Right. And is there research on that as well? How?
I'm not the expert on that, but from what I can tell,
Yes.
yes, we are wired for it. My lab did one informal study with several hundred people where we just checked to see, how rewarding is kindness, for example, versus anger. You
Right.
know, Universally, people prefer kindness
Right.
to getting angry.
Yes.
So not to say that, there are a lot of injustices in the world that don't make us angry.
Right.
Yet when people are kind to us as compared to mean to us, it's a no-brainer. So it seems to be good.
Yes. Because it's sometimes people use anger to create change. They say, yeah, I'm not motivated enough. I'm not motivated. I don't have the willpower to create change or change my habits. So maybe when I get more motivated or I get really angry with myself, and I think the research doesn't show that, right?
Well, I would say, anger takes a lot of energy,
Yeah.
and also it can, it certainly can be activating. And so, like I said, there are a lot of things that are, can make a lot of people angry, a lot of injustices. And we can take that energy and we can transform it,
Mm.
through compassionate action. And so here we can ask ourselves, what's the most efficient way to help the world change?
Mm.
And can we transform and take that energy that comes from anger and turn it toward, making sustainable change in a way that engenders compassionate and responses, as compared to just more anger? Because
Yeah.
sometimes if we run at somebody with anger, they're just going to respond with anger, and then we
Mm.
don't tend to get as far as we might if we take that energy and run at the issue with compassion.
Of course. Which actually brings me to my last question, and I wish I mean, we can chat for hours. I love the work you do, but maybe a final question, which is distinction between mind and brain. So obviously, the work you're doing is influencing the brain, and the brain influences the mind. And sometimes people get caught like, what's brain, what's mind?
Yeah, well, this is an easy one. I don't know. Pragmatically speaking, the two seem to be intimately linked. So I focus on the habit change piece, and like,
Yes.
let's train people to be curious and kind, and they can be curious about the brain mind connection and this and that. They can also see if they're getting caught up in trying to figure that out. People have tried to figure that out for centuries. I don't
Yes.
know if anybody's nailed it yet, and I certainly would not be the person to say I know the answer.
So that's so good to hear as well, because there's a lot of information that presumes, oh, this is what it is, and this is what brain, and this is what mind is, and it's really, I guess there's part of the mystery still. Like we
Yeah,
know
and
how,
it's okay.
yeah,
It's okay not to know, right? We
no,
can rest in the
yeah.
not knowing, and we can also take that energy. I like to focus it on pragmatic things, like
Yes,
how can we increase kindness in the world?
yes. What a beautiful way to end on. How can we all increase kindness in the world? And for people to find out about your work, I mentioned the website, drjudd.com. Anything else, anywhere else you want them to know? And I can put it in the chat function.
Sure. I'm on Twitter at Judd Brewer, Judbrewer, and then Instagram, Dr. Judd, Dr.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for your incredible work that has so much value and continues to grow. So thank you for joining us and really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you.